Okay, well tonight we are going to focus on chironomids. So now don't, if you're not I think a lot of people are Stillwater, yeah? If you're not, the same kind of things apply to rivers. Yeah, they are not beginner flies, but we'll try to make them easy.
You should be like a step ahead of Curtis all the time.
Pretty much, yeah. You'll know exactly what I'm tying before I get it on the hook. So this is a size 16. This is a Hannock 530. Sometimes I use the 333. Anyway, they're both kind of, depending on how you look at them, I'd call them emerger hooks, but I think they call them light check hooks.
Is it a 230 or a 333?
This one's probably a 333. I also use the 530 on these. They're really very, very similar. In fact, I think the 333 is slightly thicker gauge wire. So again, not a huge deal. So this, if you've seen a pattern I tie called the foam merger, it's a similar concept. I don't think, there is something about this Easy Magic Dub. It's basically a super micro chenille. When it gets wet, I think these fibers just kind of hold the water and it creates a translucent effect. I don't know, but any pattern that I fish that has this Easy Magic Dub in it is pretty killer. So anyway, this goes back. When I started getting into chironomids and stillwaters a lot more hardcore, for me it was kind of a translation from river fishing and the traditional midges to obviously bigger bugs, a little bit difference in how they hatch and how they behave. So my foam merger, I would fish my foam merger quite a bit. And the foam merger, if you're not familiar with it, has a gray or black foam head and then one of these Easy Magic Dub extended bodies, and that's pretty much it. So what it does is it orients itself somewhat vertically in the surface film, and the trout take it for a trapped midge emerger. It's super effective. This time of year, hardly a day goes by in the shop where we don't have somebody coming in that'd been fishing them out on the river. Anyway, so I've been using those out on some stillwater and did really well. But then I started, sometimes I'll just set up either with my camera or whatever and just kind of monitor what the fish are doing. And a couple times, as I've noticed, as these chironomids are hatching, these bigger, they're, maybe a size, let's say 14 on up to 12, 10. As they're hatching, I noticed that the breathers, the shuck part of the breathers, so they're actually not the breathers because the bugs are already emerged, were super, super white. And I started looking on the water and noticing, and I've seen this many times over, that you can really spot those shucks a mile away because of those breathers. And then one day I was kind of back in a little shallow, kind of stagnant part of the lake, and I started watching these bugs emerge. And the breathers are definitely a key. When I'd watched the fish feed, almost every instance when the bugs were at least at this phase, they were focusing on the ones that are partially in and out of the surface. So on this pattern, I've made it so that the breathers are very visible with the foam. I like that extended body. It could be a shuck, it could be the body. If you've watched midges or chironomids emerge, there's a lot, it's kind of a big buggy mess for a bit. It could also, size-wise, depending on what you're doing, it could imitate a mating midge cluster. But anyway, so that's the story behind that. And it's a relatively simple tie. So I'm just going to start, address the whole hook about to the bend, or at least where the bend begins. These don't have a defined bend. And I'm going to tie in some Mirage tinsel. This is
Start
it.
this with black thread.
Yeah, this is just black thread. And so the first part of this, I'm just laying down a shiny base. Now, pretty much every time I go out, I will take throat samples from a few fish, depending on what I'm doing. And I space it out during the day because I like to see where they're feeding, how the hatch is progressing on what they're feeding. And also from beginning of the season towards summer and into fall, how their diet changes and where they're feeding. So one of the really cool things is that I've noticed in early in the season, or at least early in the morning, if it's during the chironomid heavy time, the fish are going to be feeding often down deeper because the midges will start to pupate, and they're going to start as a red, black, or red olive, or a black olive kind of color, and they're dark as they start to pupate. And then they get closer to the surface, and I can tell this if I take a fish throat sample from a fish that I've caught in the top 3 or 4 feet, for sure it's mostly going to have silverish chironomid pupa in it. So what I'm doing with this is I'm going to create that silverish body. Again, this is somewhat of an kind of a representative pattern because they may not have all of these features at once. So the bug may hatch and it's got no more silver, but sometimes there are bugs that have begun to hatch and they do have silver. So I'm kind of trying to throw in as many trigger points as I can.
Is that small tinsel?
This one's medium. You can use small just the same. I would definitely use smaller if it were a smaller pattern. And that's the beauty of this. So if you're doing more still water, this is size 16, on up to 12 kind of thing. So they don't have to be super small. If you have noticed, and for some reason in Utah it's a little different, like if you talk to Brian Chan or Phil Rowley up in BC, they're like big, size 8s and 10s, or if you go to Pyramid, they've got really big ones. But a lot of the high mountain stuff that I fish, they're still pretty small. But bigger than a river still. So you'd be talking like 22s and 24s. And so this is just going to create a little bit of a body. And again, just to imitate that, I'm going to go at about a little over half the way up and then tie that off. Okay, so now as you can kind of see on this, I've got the base underbody is the tinsel, and now I'm going to tie in my Easy Magic Dub. Now normally I'll just, depending on how small I get, I may singe the end of these, but I didn't bring my lighter, so it doesn't matter. And I like to tie this in so that it's overlapped, so it goes beyond the bend or the end of the hook there by, I don't know, half a shank length. You don't want this to be super, super long. And then the one thing that happens with these, because it's a core material, is that if you tie it on there and then pull it tight, sometimes we'll flip to one side of the hook or the other. So I'll lash it on there pretty good and then make sure I've got the tension on so that it stays on the top of the hook. And then I'll just trim off the excess here. So that's, from my point of view, the tail looks way too long, but that's my angle. So anyway, now I'm going to tie in what a lot of people don't realize is actually a really good dry fly material, and that's trigger point. So EP fibers, if you've heard, I'm sure you've all heard of EP fibers. It's the guy that makes EP, Enrico Puglisi. It's called trigger point, and the main difference between the two, they're essentially the same, is that trigger point is treated with like a watershed or something. So it floats super well, and I've been using this on wings for terrestrials, like this for midges or chironomids for the past couple, 3 years, and it's good stuff. So what I'll do is kind of take about an hook eye width of materials, and this is going to serve two purposes. Number one, it'll kind of serve as our wing going over the back here, and I'm just going to tie that in longer because I'll trim it. Okay, so it's gonna be just that wing, and whether or not, again, the chironomid may not, the pupa may not have had its wings pop out yet, but again, we're trying to imitate as many little trigger points as possible. So we've got that on there, and then we're going to use the front of this to come off in front of our breathers, like so. So I'm going to leave that on there, and we'll just tie the other two materials right on top of it and then trim it when we're done. I'll trim it a little bit here, but I'll finalize that when I'm done tying it. So now the next material is going to be one of my favorite all-around dubbings, and that is ice dub. It's UV shrimp pink, and it's actually orange. But if you get in there, there's a lot of pink fibers. And so Lance Egan, who's our shop manager, his Frenchie's got this in it. There's a couple other patterns that we fish that has this shrimp pink in it. And I think it's a super chironomid heavy color, because if you look at their wing buds when they're hatching, when they're pupating, they go from kind of a palish yellow, palish orange, all the way to more of a bright red, bright orange. But I think this color here represents the in-between kind of average of those. Plus, ice dub is a fish catcher just in general. So I'm going to take a little bit of this, just enough to give it a little bit of a thorax. And I don't want to overdub this too much, just enough to give me a couple of wraps. Little goes a long way. I want to make sure that I don't trap my trigger point fibers down any more than I have. Okay, and then the final little piece here is some white foam. Now this, so what I have here is Rainey's Evasote. It is, I'm not sure how it's made, but at the end of the day, this is a very, and I tried this on the foam merger, it's a great floating foam for small patterns. So if I'm going to throw a big terrestrial or some sort of big attractor pattern, I could use closed cell like Crosslink or just craft foam, and it's not going to matter. It'll still float. It'll hold a ton of floating. You can put deer hair on it. You could put trigger point or EP fibers, whatever. But when you're dealing with small patterns like this, you really need maximum flotation ability, and that's why I like the Evasote. Will it work with regular foam? Sure. But the thing is, with this pattern, you need to make sure you dress it so that only the trigger point and the foam are dressed if you're using float. Because you kind of want this back end to kick beneath the surface a bit. Sometimes you might not, and that's where with chironomids it gets kind of tricky, because I've seen it where I can visibly see them taking bugs that are in the surface film and ignoring adults that are on the surface. And then, like a light switch, it'll swap. And they'll go from taking stuff in the surface film to stuff only on the surface. That's the beauty of this one, is once that happens, you could slap some floating on the whole thing and you're good to go. So it is a nice little versatile pattern. So what I do here is I just cut a very small piece of foam. This is, you don't have to round it or anything. I just use, kind of keep it in the same shape. This is about the cross section I'm looking at. Width-wise, about, let's say, the hook gap-ish. And I cut, because these are small, I cut this longer. And the way I do this, so I'm going to stick it on the hook parallel to the hook shank. This is easy. This is an easy way to get this tied on. And the same thing works with barbell eyes, It works with anything you need to lash perpendicular to your hook. Put it on parallel first, and I'll usually give it a couple of wraps like so. And then I'll come in here and twist it. And then once I twist it, I can come up behind and follow that tie-in point and just crimp it down like that. Okay, now I want to make sure I'm not trapping any more fibers than I have to. Not going to matter that much if you do, because midges have legs, so at the end of the day it's not a big deal. Now I'm going to preen everything back and come right in front underneath my EP, or the trigger point, and then I'm going to grab my little midge whip finisher. These little Tiemco, this is the dual purpose valve. They're the midge size, so you can see how big the head is on that. And so I'll pull the bobbin up and out of the way so that I can still use my thumb and index finger to grab. And then we simply throw a couple, 3 whip finishes in, tighten that up, and then we'll just come in here and cut her off. Okay, and then final thing again, I still got my trigger point coming out there, and I'm going to come in here and pull on my, you got to pull, I'm all fingers here, so I'm going to have to pull on the foam, and as I pull on foam, I'm just going to come in making sure I'm not cutting anything I shouldn't, and get close enough to it on each side. And what happens is when you put some tension on that and you release it after you cut it, it goes back and it kind of forms a nice little rounded shape. Like that. So it kind of looks like a jumbled buggy mess, but once you're dressing it, it'll sit on the surface film. And this is one of those situations where a lot of times you'll see guys scratching their heads because, if you're a hardcore Stillwater guy, you probably don't have a floating line rigged up, which you obviously want to do in this case. And a lot of times on the water you'll see, especially during chironomid hatches, even though they're not taking anything on the surface, you'll still see that porpoise fin rise. And again, most of the time it's going to trend, it will go from that phase to actually surface takes. So even though, anyway, my point is a lot of times as a Stillwater guy, you're going to get conditioned to the fact that the fish are not taking dries or not taking something on the surface or in the surface. But as I've done this more and more, I realize that I'm probably not catching them on the surface because I haven't been fishing anything on the surface or right in the surface film. I've even had a few times where I could get fish that I know, if I know there's chironomids around, this is a big enough, and I can actually see it, it's a big enough attractor that I can get some fish to come up and take. So most of the time when I'm fishing chironomids, I'll have a dry fly rod on the boat so that I can throw a dry if I want. Anywho, any questions on that?
Does your black material, does it stay stiff or is it?
No, that's a great question. It does stay pretty stiff. It doesn't. There's no movement in it to speak of, and that's kind of the thing that my Fomerger, which is very similar to this, was made so that it would hang in the water somewhat vertically. It's not going to be exactly vertical, but okay.